Hi, this is Scott Maybe, and I'm talking about monitoring, controlling project risks, the last process in the project risk management process group. So I'm just going to cover a few things today, mainly focusing on monitoring and controlling techniques during the project risk management processes, focusing mainly on risk reassessment, what that is, the risk audit, and reserve analysis. We'll also cover some of the outputs, including the lessons learned, some looking at reserve analysis in a little more detail, and also looking at the workarounds and management reserve, which we'll cover later on. Let's start with, first of all, risk reassessment. What is risk reassessment? Essentially, it's the process of reviewing risks that you've already identified and determining how those are changing throughout the project. So how the risks, the individual risk events, are they changing? Are some risk events no longer valid, or they've been obsolete during the project lifecycle? Have they escalated and gotten worse? Have they gotten better? Have some threats turned into opportunities? Have some opportunities turned into threats? So you're reassessing those risks, and along the way, what's going to happen, you're inevitably going to identify new risks as a result of the reassessment process. But so many project managers fail in this area. It's one of the most important areas of project risk management because so much bureaucracy and a lot of OPAs, organizational process assets, are created that it become a corporate policy as a result of bureaucracy, which is not really required. They're internal requirements. They're not like legal requirements or external requirements from regulators. These are internal requirements, mostly because of just policy. And a lot of those requirements go by the wayside when the work actually starts. So for example, risk registers don't get updated. They're not used as tools. It's more of a formality, more of a requirement because that's what the project manager is expected to do. But the risk register is useless, and a risk matrix these are useless to the project manager unless the project manager actually uses them as a tool to manage risk. So risk reassessment allows a project manager to keep the risk register fresh, keep it up to date, and to move risks in terms of the severity in and out of different categories of severity, and also to eliminate certain risks and, of course, establish new risks in the project. So let's look at a type of sort of general steps involved with risk reassessment. And we'll start with, as the project is in the monitoring, controlling phase, the work is being done on the project, inevitably new risks are going to be identified. Those unknown unknowns that we were faced with earlier on in the project, well, guess what? Some of those unknowns are now known. So during the monitoring controlling phase, we need to make sure that we're spending some time identifying new risks as they come up. Some of those will be identified through a formal process of maybe a brainstorming session while we're in the monitoring control phase, and some of them will just be brought up simply by workers on the field or project management team members or stakeholders or even the sponsor or the client. Either way, we're identifying those new risks. And then, of course, what's the next step? We need to assess the probability impact of those risks using the best information we have or estimates from subject matter experts. Then we have to decide what we're going to do about it. Are we going to create a risk response to those risks? So we need to determine which risk response strategy would be best for those opportunities and threats. And then, of course, as we're monitoring, controlling those risks, we need to determine if triggers have occurred and if there's a need to implement a risk response that we've planned as needed. So this is all processes that we've already been doing in the project. We're just doing them for new risks. Okay, so it's the first time we've looked at new risks beyond the first batch of risks that we identified when we were in the planning phase. And then, of course, those unplanned risks, those are going to be identified now that the work is being done on the project and we're monitoring and controlling the work. And we're going to determine, because they're unplanned, we need to do something called a workaround plan. And we'll look at that later on. What is a workaround plan? So that's a new term. But those unplanned risks that inevitably are going to come up actually become a problem with the project. and then we have to react to those. So we can't be proactive with something we didn't plan on in the first place, but we can at least react to those through a workaround plan. Okay, so for example here, I'll give an example of a new risk. Okay, so due to recent changes in national weather patterns like a tornado that may hit the area, which now may cause damage to the construction site of your project, as an example. So that's a new risk that would be impossible to know during the planning phase. But now that the work is being done, there's this new threat to our project. So then we have to assess the probability and impact. We might say the probability would be low and the impact would be very high. Okay, and we create a risk response plan. In this case, we're going to mitigate the impact. We can't mitigate the probability, but we can reduce the impact on our project because we're going to remove all equipment and machinery from the site until further notice. So at least we can reduce the impact of destroying our machinery and equipment. We can't necessarily reduce the impact of the land and some of the work that's already been done, but at least we can mitigate the impact. And then determine if triggers have occurred and implement a risk response plan. Well, we can discover if there's any signs or warning signs. So we can look at things like triggers, like announcements on the news that indicate a tornado threat is likely in the area, and then implement those risk responses immediately. Okay, this is all stuff that we've seen before. Nothing is really new here. The difference is that now we're identifying new risks while the project is actually in motion and being executed. And then we identify these unplanned risks. So what would be an example of unplanned risk? Let's say, for example, suddenly tomorrow, there's an announcement that 100% tariffs on steel fabrications from our current supplier are announced. So as of tomorrow, we're gonna have to start paying 100% tariffs on steel fabrications from a supplier, a key supplier in a different country. Okay, that's an unknown risk. We didn't even know that was going to happen. And it's now a problem. It's not a risk. It's not uncertain, and it has a direct impact. So it's now a problem. So we can only, at our best, react to that. We cannot be proactive anymore. So we implement something called a workaround plan. A workaround plan is essentially a contingency plan, except the planning and the resources and the money doesn't come from a contingency plan, which is under the control of the project manager. It comes from something called a management reserve. And the management reserve is controlled by the sponsor. It's controlled by the organization. It's to manage those risks, those unknown risks. And the reason for this is because the project manager can't be held to those risks. It's not fair to the project manager to have to bear that responsibility. So the project manager can use management reserves, which are under the control of senior management, usually a sponsor. But if the project manager is given authorization to use management reserves to pay for the workaround plan, then the workaround plan can be used to react to these unknown risks. And the money will not come out of the contingency fund. And the contingency fund is used to respond to known risks that the project manager was able to identify. So there's difference between contingency fund and management reserves. And the contingency plan comes from is paid for by the contingency fund. The workaround plan is paid for by the management reserve. Okay, let's look at other steps that are involved with the risk reassessment process. Determine if categories of the risks need to be changed. Maybe there's new categories, or maybe some categories are now out of date and need to be reassigned or renamed or eliminated. Okay, so the categorization of the risks, and then maybe assigning the categories to different people. The watch list, remember that those green risks within a risk matrix that would be low level risks, low severity. A lot of times those green level risks are not actually severe enough to respond to. We can't respond to all project risks, so we would leave those on a watch list. But that needs to be reviewed. There's no point in putting those on a watch list if they're not going to be watched. We have to watch those risks and determine if they're getting worse or not. So we need to determine if any are now in need of a risk response plan that wasn't created when we first assessed those risks on the watch list. After that, we need to identify the risks that have passed and now can be closed in the risk register as we're monitoring, controlling throughout the life cycle. Because inevitably, some of the risks will pass and some of them will not pass at all. Some of them will just simply be obsolete. If you have a time-based risk, and with a date, then you can easily determine through monitoring the risk if the risk actually occurred or not, and through the triggers, determine if the risk is going to occur. And if there's no triggers, there's no warning signs, and the date passes and the risk doesn't occur, then you can simply remove that and close it from the risk register. And then identify the risks that have been outdated and can be closed in the risk register, which is very similar to the point above. So let's look at an example of the categories. Let's say we add social risk as a new category for risks that expose a project to risks involving social movements. There's many social movements happening throughout the world today. And so if during our project planning, we didn't identify that as a category, but now we're realizing that there are many of these new project risk events that are related more to social movements, we could add a new category called social risk and assign that to a new member of our team. And in terms of a watch list, let's say risk involving competition was low severity, but is now moved to moderate severity due to changing market conditions, due to increased competition in the marketplace. So that would warrant us to take that out of the watch list and now put it with the moderate severity risks. So it needs to be dealt with a plan. So we have a response plan that's now required for that. We would change our risk register to reflect those changes. If we identify risks that have passed and can be closed in the risk register, let's look at that tornado threat, the one that was possibly going to hit our region. Well, it didn't occur. The tornado's passed now, and there's no longer a threat. So we can close that risk in the risk register and release the funds from a contingency plan if we had one in place. Okay, why is it in the contingency plan? Well, because a tornado was actually something we were able to identify, but we didn't know if it was going to happen or not. So it was uncertain and it had a certain amount of impact. Technically, it's a risk. We did identify it. It's not an unknown unknown. It's not like a black swan event, which is an unknown unknown. We knew about it. We identified it, and we assessed it. We had a contingency plan in place, which was to mitigate the impact. And we no longer have to pay for that plan. We can take that out of contingency, and we can release those funds from contingency and move on with the project. Now we can identify risks that have been outdated and can be closed in the register. Like, for example, if we were waiting on a government to approve a patent, okay, we can now close that risk in the risk register because maybe the government has approved the patent. It's no longer a risk, and we can take it out of the register and just close it in the register and write notes, and that would allow us to keep the risk register fresh. So this is the risk reassessment steps. They're all fairly obvious and fairly natural and intuitive, but it's really important for a project manager to actually reassess the risk of the project, because otherwise there's no point in doing any of the other work we've done in it before. There's no point in writing a plan, a project risk management plan. There's no point in performing risk identification tactics. There's no point in qualitative and quantitative risk analysis, and there's certainly no point in planning risk responses and implementing risk responses if we're not going to actually do those through monitoring, controlling, and executing those risk responses and determining how well we're doing at all. So risk assessment is really important in project risk management. Now, the risk audit comes usually close to the end of closing of the project or even closing the project, although none of the processes in project risk management fall under the process group of closing. It's really tied with that. Usually a risk audit, and risk is becoming more common in external audits in the world, but we're talking here about an internal audit, something done usually by another project manager. You as a project manager may be tasked with this one day. If you're experiencing some idle time and you're working between projects, you might be tasked with auditing the project risk management of another project or another project manager. So you, as a project manager, need to ensure that if your organization requires a risk audit, that it is conducted before the project is closed and the members are dispersed to new projects. So, of course, a formal audit should be defined in the plan prior to conducting the audit. So some of the components involved with a risk audit that a project manager would want to look at and get the proper documents and assess would be, first of all, the success of the risk identification process. So the project manager would be reviewing the project risk management processes in order to determine what unknown risks were later identified. So could those unknown risks have been identified or not? Would it be reasonable to say the project management team could have identified more of these unknown risks in reality? And what risks actually occurred and never occurred? So if there's a lot of project risks that were identified that never occurred, then maybe the project management team was identifying unreasonable or unrealistic risks. However, if the project still had many problems, then the project management team likely didn't identify the right risks. They identified all the wrong risks and not the right risks. So risk identification is really important and should be audited. Also, the success of follow-up responses. So as we respond to the project risks through our response plans and they're implemented, were they actually monitored and controlled? So what was the follow-up? If you have risk responses that aren't working, you obviously have to follow up in some way. The project manager needs to respond to that and make sure that the risk responses are actually correct and they're being properly implemented. And that happens through the monitoring controlling process. Now, the level of accuracy of probability and impact scoring, this is difficult since it is a qualitative approach. Unless the risks are moved to a quantitative method, then we need to determine if the scoring system was even effective. So if that risk matrix that we're using is even really effective, if our scaling system was actually appropriate for the project. Remember, this is all very subjective. It's to create an order to our thoughts, and so that we can prioritize our risks. And did the risk ranking system that we use make any sense? Did the risk matrix make any sense? Was it appropriate for our project? Or did it throw our project management team off? Were they prioritizing the wrong risks and not prioritizing the right risks? And the performance of the risk owners. Remember, the risk events have been assigned to project members, team members. So did they actually perform the activities they were assigned to perform? And did they respect the schedule and budget? Did they respect the contingency fund? These are some of the questions that you would ask in a risk audit. Also, the change requests. Remember, change requests happen whenever we have to respond to a risk, whenever we have to implement a plan, whenever we have to make changes during the monitoring control phase that affect anything regarding the project that deviates from the plan, we have to implement a change request. So you want to make sure that you keep records of those change requests, because if you get audited, or if you're the auditor, either way, change requests are going to be something that are going to be asked to be delivered to the auditor. And the auditor is going to review those change requests and make sure that they align with the project scope and key deliverables. And then were the activities and documents adjusted accordingly based on the change requests? Usually this goes through a integrated change control system, through a change control board. And of course, those change requests are approved or denied. And then the changes in the project align with those change requests. So if you have many changes in a project with no change requests, then obviously you didn't follow the plan and procedures, which is a major problem. And vice versa. If you have change requests that have been approved, but no changes were actually made, then again, you're not following proper integrated change control processes, which can create a lot of risks for the project. So the risk auditor would be looking for change requests and seeing how they align with the reality of what happened to the project. The contingency plans. One of the questions is, were the contingency reserves actually used? And if so, what were they used for? And did they not get used when they should have been used? Or were they used too frequently? So as a project manager, you want to use your contingency reserve. Yes, you do want to use them if you need to, because oftentimes it's better to use the reserves than not use them at all, but you don't want to rely on them too much and too frequently. Just enough so that you can balance the cost of using the reserve with the cost of not using the reserve. So this is a risk management, basic risk management approach. So contingency plans is going to be something that's likely going to be audited and in the risk audit itself. And then the resources, so the project resources, whether physical or human resources, did the project experience any resource constraints to manage the risk of the project? So this risk audit will ask these basic questions, usually in this type of a category, in those categories. And you might have just a one-page document or a variety of different pages with a cover letter like this, where the risk audit has some different events, list of different project risks, and some of the causes, the responses. The risk audit itself is going to talk about the processes of project risk management, from planning, identifying qualitative and quantitative analysis, risk responses, and implementing risk responses, and then monitoring, controlling. So those are some of the areas that you could be audited on. The purpose of the risk audit is to not get anyone in trouble or to chastise anyone. The purpose of the risk audit is ultimately so that the organization can learn from what went right and what went wrong about the project from the perspective of someone who wasn't doing the project, to try to learn more about what they can do right the next time. So that's really the purpose of a risk audit. Now, monitoring, controlling techniques also involve trend and variance analysis. So variance analysis is when you're comparing project results against the plan results and what was the deviation between what you planned and what you actually were able to achieve. And then, of course, looking at the trend would examine over time if the project's results are getting better or worse, if they're improving or diminishing. So as a project manager during monitoring and controlling, you want to look at the plans you put in place to manage your risk and respond to your risk events, then determine what actually happened and how much that deviates from your plan, and whether you're seeing a trend in that deviation over time that's good or bad. And then, of course, reserve analysis compares the amount of reserves remaining to the amount of risk remaining at any time in the project in order to determine if the remaining reserve is adequate. So if you've already depleted 50% of your project reserves, but you're only 20% done your project, and you have 80% left to go, then it's obvious that you're not running according to plan. If the majority of your risks are going to occur later on in your project, well, you've only accomplished 20% of the work so far. So it's likely you're going to run out of money. But also, we don't want to have too much money in the reserve. If we're close to the end of our project and we've hardly used any of our reserve at all, then we really need to release those funds so they can be used more productively. So you can determine contingency reserves, and this was already covered earlier on in quantitative risk analysis, but you can determine contingency reserves using quantitative methods such as the EMV method, or expected monetary value, which also falls in decision tree analysis, or even going as far as Monte Carlo simulation to base your contingency reserve on a confidence interval or confidence level. So for example, reserve analysis can be done using simple EMV, which is probability times impact. So if we're able to quantify, for example, these 4 risks in terms of the probability and impact of those risks, then we would simply multiply probability times impact of all 4 of them, add them all up, and we can see from impact, we have $4,500 in total cost impact. But of course, we're not going to assign $4,500 to a contingency to absorb that impact, because not all of the risks are 100% likely to occur. That's why they're risks. Where they're not problems, they're risks. So they're not all likely to occur. So we would use EMV, which is the probability times impact, and add all those up, and it gives us a total contingency of $1,100. So that is not in reality what we would have to pay if, for example, risk 1 occurred. If we were correct, no, our cost would actually be $4,000. But the reason why we use EMV is because it's a long form estimate, meaning that if we were to, assuming we're accurate about our risk, costs, and impacts, then if we were to run this project to infinity, indefinitely, then the theory is that if we added up the costs each time, we would end up with a total cost on average of around the EMV level. So it's our best guess at determining the outcome of a contingency fund, but which balances probability and impact. Okay, that's one way to do it. You could also do it through a decision tree, which uses EMV. If you had multiple decisions in a project, for example, multiple ways to respond to risks or different ways to conduct a task, then you could make your contingency based off of a variety of decisions and decision analysis. So using decision trees to arrive at the primary decision based off of EMV, and you add up all of those values, it's still using EMV, but now you're doing it through a process of eliminations by looking at specific risk-based decisions and then adding up your EMV values to get your reserve analysis that way and determine your contingency fund. You can also look at reserve analysis through Monte Carlo simulation, which takes activities or individual risk events, and you can use something called a PERT estimate, which is a distribution of from optimistic, most likely, and pessimistic. You can see here deterministic values in the rightmost column under PERT estimate, which is simply optimistic plus 4 times the most likely plus the pessimistic, and divide that by 6, and you'll end up with those numbers. And the total here in terms of days becomes 18.3 days. Or sorry, this is in months, 18.3 months. Okay, so running a Monte Carlo simulation then gives you a variety of results. So if we ran this, say, 500 or 1,000 times through simulation, then we can take those random numbers between optimistic, most likely, and pessimistic. That's a distribution. Anything between, for example, activity A of 4 months to 8 months. Okay, so at the lowest point, we have 4 months, and at the highest point, we have 8 months. Okay, what we're saying here is on average, using a PERT average, weighted average, we'll be able to achieve the activity A in 5.3 months. But in reality, anything between 4 and 8 months is possible. So if we just run a simulation 500 times or 1,000 times or even 1,000,000 times and plot in random numbers using our distribution, then we can see that the chances of completion for 16 months is actually only 2%, whereas 21 months is 100% chance. So anything in between there would determine how many months we need in contingency for this project, depending on how confident we want to be, and balancing that out with how much time we actually have available to be able to contribute to those tasks. So we would answer the question not in terms of a static number, but in terms of a confidence level that would be based on, you know, the organization or the sponsor or the client and what they're comfortable with. So that's reserve analysis. Now, management reserves are used to, as I said, manage unknown risks throughout the duration of the project. The project manager actually requires the authorization of the sponsor to use the management reserve to cover the cost of implementing those workaround plans. Remember, workaround plans are reactive plans to respond to the crisis of having an unknown risk now occur. So the project manager is not bound to those risks by funding those through the contingency reserve. They use management reserves to do that. So you would never see an unknown risk in a risk register. You would never see an unknown risk in a contingency reserve. That's just money set aside to deal with the realities of life, which is managing unknown risks. Now, I want to look at risk data quality assessment. Okay, so when we are monitoring, controlling risks, we have to look at variance and trends, like as I said before. And of course, looking at variance and looking at trends, look at that analysis is only as good as the data that we actually have. So the availability of having data for identified risks in like a PMIS or any sort of a database is only as good as the data that we have, and that becomes information through the form of reports that we can use. So we have to make sure the data is actually reliable and it has integrity and it's accurate before we can convert that into information we can use to analyze how well we're doing in a project and make decisions. So we can look at something like work performance information, which then compares risks that have occurred with how they were expected to occur. And then from there, we can determine how effective our risk response planning and implementation actually was. And that can help to provide a mechanism to communicate that information to key stakeholders and to make better decisions, which is really what risk monitoring controlling is all about. It's about making better decisions now and in the future. So if we look at an example here, this is a chart which shows On the leftmost side, the plan, which is, first of all, 3 different risks. And then what our initial, through quantitative analysis, what our initial cost estimate was for each one of these risks. In this case, they're all estimated to cost $1,000 to the project. Now, the risk response cost estimate, okay, meaning that the cost estimate for the risk response itself, because risk response costs are rarely free, we have to pay for those risk responses. We could estimate what those will cost as well, and then determine, okay, well, if we know how much it's going to cost to respond to the risk, then we can also estimate how much that's going to reduce the impact by, because there's no point in responding to a risk if we can't reduce the cost of the risk, or at least reduce the probability of the risk. So in this case, we're looking at 3 risks where we have risk response plans that we believe will reduce the cost of the risk itself. So we're actually looking at an impact mitigation, for example, risk response. And then we have, of course, residual risk, the risk that remains after implementing a risk response, what remains. And we see here that these 3 risks all have some level of residual risk. So if we add up then the cost of the risk response plus the residual risk, we have the net risk cost. So if all of these risks had risk responses that were implemented, this is our best guess in terms of how much it actually is going to cost us for the impact we have to absorb for the risk itself, plus the cost of the response plan that we planned. Okay, and then on the other side, we have results. So we have the actual risk response cost. We'll never know what the impact cost of the risk was based on our original estimate, but we can measure what the actual cost ended up being after we implemented the risk response. So what we actually had to pay, what we actually, the risk we had to actually bear. So then we can calculate the actual net risk cost. So what we paid for the risk response cost, the cost of the risk response plus the risk we had to actually absorb from the actual risk itself. And that gives our actual net risk cost. So we have plan on the left and results on the right. And then we can calculate our variance. So for example, in this case, we have a variance of $100. So where did that come from? Well, the risk 1 variance came from the actual net risk cost minus the net risk cost. So in this case, or I should say actually the net risk cost minus the difference between the actual and the net risk cost, which is going to be $900 what we estimated minus $800 that we actually incurred, which means that we had a variance of $100. So it's a positive variance. The question is, why do we have a positive variance? Well, if we look at the risk 1 impact cost variance, it's $600 what we planned minus $600 what we actually absorbed. So that's actually a 0 variance. So we know it didn't come from the cost of the risk itself or the actual reduction in the cost as a result of the risk response. There was no variance there. Let's look at the cost of the risk response itself. We estimated the cost of the risk response to be $300, but it actually cost us $200. So that's where our variance comes from, our positive variance. We estimated that the risk response cost was higher than what it actually ended up being. So in a risk audit, that would be something we look at. Risk response 1 cost estimate was too high, which caused that variance. So we want to look at why it was too high so that we can try to become more accurate in our estimates of our risk response costs next time. Let's look at variance for risk 2. We have a $200 negative variance, which is really bad. So we got to find out where it came from. So risk 2 variance, let's just say risk 2 variance, is the difference between our actual net risk costs and what we planned, which is $600 minus the $800, the net risk cost of our plan minus what we actually incurred. So we have a negative $200 variance, which is bad. So when we planned to have less costs than we actually incurred, we incurred more than what we actually planned. So why? What happened here? Well, the risk 2 impact cost variance is the residual risk minus the actual risk impact cost itself. So we planned that through our risk response, the amount of risk remaining was going to be $400 that we were going to absorb. But in reality, we actually absorbed $600 in total impact of that risk. So that's where our variance is coming from. And the risk response cost itself, well, we know that's not part of the variance because we estimated $200 and we actually spent $200 on responding to that risk. So then in an audit, we would say that assuming that the risk impact cost estimate of $1,000 was correct, we'll never really know that in reality. But what we do know is that risk 2, the risk response did not reduce the risk impact cost as planned. So we actually incurred $600 in overall risk impact, even though we planned the residual risk would only be $400. So we were off by $200, and that's bad. We want to find out why the risk response did not reduce the impact of the risk as we expected it to. Let's look at risk 3 variance. We have the actual, the difference between the actual and the net risk cost, which is a net risk cost of $800 plan minus what we actually incurred, which is $1,200, which is a negative $400 cost variance. So something's wrong here. Question is why? Let's take a minute to try to determine what went wrong. Well, first of all, the impact cost variance is the difference between the $600 residual risk, which is what we plan to have to absorb that we could do nothing about, minus what we actually absorbed, which is $1,000, gives us a negative $400 variance. So that's where the variance is coming from. And we can see that our risk response cost variance is 0. We actually were bang on with that. We were correct with that. So we were right about our risk response costs. So in this case, again, we have risk 3, the risk response had no effect on the risk at all this time. So we spent $200 and we still have to absorb the $1,000 in the risk cost estimate. So the risk response in this case had absolutely no effect on the risk itself. And we were better off doing nothing at all. So I'll leave you with this question. What could we do differently next time? Or what could we do differently for the remaining risks on the project so that we could potentially budget or estimate more realistically, or else create better response plans? What do you think we could do differently? That would be the question that you'd want to ask as a project manager. Okay, just looking at change requests. Changes to project scope or activities or deliverables or processes or budget all require change requests. Where change requests are required for any workaround plans, any corrective actions, any recommended preventative actions, anything that's not to the plan, anything that deviates from the plan requires a change request, requires going through integrative change control, requires likely going through a change control board and having any change request approved or denied from the integrated change control process. So, this is an example of a change request form, which has a variety of different information on here. There's going to be the current conditions, the proposed changes, and why we're making the change, explaining if it's a cost impact or time impact, quality scope, or another type of impact, what the impact might be. And then, of course, we have to have signatures and whether it was improved or denied. Again, remember, change requests, very important. If you get audited, you want to make sure that you are keeping record of all of your change requests and that they're actually implemented effectively to avoid your risk. Project management plan updates. So as you're monitoring and controlling, as a result of the change requests, then you're going to have to update the project management plan as needed. The risk register needs to be updated. So revisiting those low priority risks on the watch list, ensuring that they're still low priority as one of the outputs of monitoring and controlling. You're also going to need to update the risk register with any risk audit that you receive during the project and any periodic reviews. And then updating the risk register with explaining what the actual outcomes of the project risks were and of the risk responses. So as I showed you earlier, in the work performance information, looking at variance would definitely be something you'd include in the risk register to keep that fresh. A good risk register really tells a story of the risk in a project. So OPA is updating those templates for the risk management plan. The project impact, probably an impact matrix could be updated. And of course, the risk register itself, the risk report that's sent out from time to time, the lessons learned document, which we'll look at in a moment, and then something like the risk breakdown structure would also be something that would be updated, could be updated. Now let's look at lessons learned. Lessons learned is not the same thing as an audit, because the lessons learned is conducted by the actual project management team or the project manager. It's not conducted externally from the project like an audit. It's usually a review session with a formal report as a deliverable. It needs to be conducted soon after the project is closed out. So during the close, usually during the closing process group, this is where you would conduct that. But it is included in monitoring, controlling outputs. So, this provides a realistic, practical perspective on identified risks. You're only going to know this if you're monitoring, controlling. So if you're not monitoring, controlling, you're not going to know if things worked or not. So that's why it's in monitoring, controlling. So looking at identified risks, residual risks, secondary risks, which are risks created as a result of a initial response plan, the unknown risks, so the unknown risks that you have incurred throughout the project, you would know that through monitoring, controlling. And then any issues through the project lifecycle would be in lessons learned. So lessons learned really asks, what went right? What went right? Things that can go right in a project: no scope creep. The resources are all used correctly. They're allocated correctly. Contingency plans are in place when they're required. That would be ideal. There's good communication between team members. Everyone's communicating effectively. Team members are responsive. They're not impossible to get a hold of, or they are responsive to requests, and they are communicating effectively. The team is able to look at what they can control versus what they can't control effectively as well. The project manager needs to be responding to team issues throughout the project, so that's sort of relating to leadership. The objectives were achieved within the time frame that they were given, and of course, ideally, the project was achieved on or close to budget when the project closes. And that could all be sort of things to look for that we would strive to have go right. And that would be in the lessons learned. And we want to communicate how we did it with the future project managers and the organization so that we can implement those effectively. Now, what went wrong, things you want to look for, warning signs. The organizational process requirements act as barriers to required work. There's simply just too much bureaucracy, too much red tape, too many forms, too many processes, too much formality so that people can't actually get the work done. That's bad. That can lead to a lot of project risks. Organizational changes lead to resource issues. So if you have functional managers, for example, that are getting moved around, and you're in a matrix, a weak matrix structure for an organization, for example, and you have all these organizational changes. Well, the resources, as a project manager, you don't own those resources. You can't control those resources. The functional manager controls those resources. And if you've got a lot of changes in the organization, that can add to a lot of issues with the project, which need to be managed very delicately through project risk management. So what could you learn to do better next time in that regard? Procedures were described after completing tasks instead of before. So this is an issue with proactive management and really an issue with planning. We're talking about proactive, so that's planning related. So planning could be improved going forward. Inadequate training of project team and workers. So that's really leading the project team, ensuring that the training that the project team members and workers have is adequate. And if it's not, then you can try to fix that next time. High stress in the project team. That's usually a result of poor communication, poor leadership, and really a poor risk culture, because stress a lot of times is related to worrying about the future or reacting to problems, both of which can be mitigated through proper risk culture. Inaccurate schedules versus real work. So the scheduling is just too tight and the real work is taking a lot longer than anticipated. So again, we're not effectively managing and building risk in to what we do, and we have a poor risk culture. As a result, we end up with inaccurate schedules versus what we actually need to do the work. Unrealistic budgets, same thing. So we have, budgets are not building risk into the models that we're using or our estimates versus what we actually have to end up incurring. So we're doing the best we can to manage costs, but we're not building risk in, which is, of course, building the variability in outcomes versus what we actually have to incur in costs. And efficient meetings, if we have a lot of problems in a project, the more problems we have, the more people are going to complain. And the more people complain, the less we deviate from productivity. If we don't do anything about the complaints and we don't make better decisions, we end up just with an organization that becomes very toxic, and we end up complaining in meetings, or we don't communicate effectively at all. And either way, we're not getting anything out of those meetings, so it's very inefficient. Also called a waste of time meeting. So contingency actions, lessons learned, we can look at the recommended actions for future projects or future project managers to address things that went wrong or went right during the project. We want to capture the best practices for the future, and we also want to be able to know what went wrong so that future project managers can implement better planning and better execution and monitoring and controlling for the future. So some things that could go wrong: inefficient equipment. What could we do in the future? We could add maybe required equipment early into the scheduling process, and so that we aren't worrying about inefficient equipment later on. We would just schedule that earlier on and make sure those resources are available. Something else that commonly could go wrong in a project: observations were not captured during the project. So we just weren't documenting what we observed. And so we could establish a system to document project issues as they occur. If we didn't have a system in place, that's likely the reason why observations weren't captured. So we need to always be positive and constructive and look at how we can do better next time and lessons learned. What else goes wrong? Project risks were identified but not dealt with. Very common. We identify project risk, do a great job of that, but it's not really used as a tool. It's just used as more of a formality. So it's more of a technique, but if it's not a tool, then there's no point in using it. So project risks are identified but not dealt with. So we need to have sponsor commit to a plan for corrective action with a system of accountability for staff. So at that point, maybe the sponsor wants to get involved and have some more of a formal process for making sure that the project manager and team members are held accountable to not just identifying risks, but actually doing something about them. So this is an example of a lessons learned document here with a variety of different areas and the knowledge area, whatever it might be, the different knowledge areas of the project management and the lessons that were learned, what worked well, what didn't work well, and what we could do next time. Last but not least, looking at workarounds. I've mentioned it several times in this presentation, but workarounds, again, are workaround plans that are reactive. So they are to react to problems, usually a crisis, as a result of unplanned risks, unplanned, unknown risks. Remember, known unknown risks are still identifiable, but unknown risks are not identifiable. So these are unknown. They're unplanned, completely unplanned risks that now become a problem or a crisis in the process of occurring. So we require a reaction to that to try to mitigate it. So we need to take immediate action in order to contain the damages of the project or it could also be for opportunities, but in this case for threats. So they are workarounds. They're not recorded in the risk register. They're not actively accepted risks. These would be passively accepted by default. They're simply unknown unknowns. So they're paid for by the workaround plans are paid for by management reserves and not contingency reserves. Remember that. Workarounds are plans that are put in place quickly to respond to these unplanned, unknown risks that are reactive planning. They're reacting and responding as fast as possible to reduce the damage on the project. So they're covered by management reserves, not by contingency reserves. So I hope that helped to be able to understand monitoring and controlling risks and the monitoring and controlling stage of project risk management.